Welcome to Undercurrents, our daily news show from Unheard's Washington Bureau. Today's guest is Matt Taibbi. Subscribe here wherever you get your podcasts and over at undercurrents.tv for the full premium experience of the show. I was told recently, by the way, that thousands of you are listening to every single episode, which is very exciting. Thank you. Now, Kash Patel, Donald Trump's nominee for director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, is promising revolutionary change if he's confirmed by the Senate. In September, before Donald Trump even won the election, Sean Ryan asked Patel how he would fix the FBI. Here's what he said.
I'd shut down the FBI Hoover building on day one and reopening the next day as a museum of the deep state. And I'd take the 7,000 employees that work in that building and send them across America to chase down criminals. Go be cops.
Now, whether it's hyperbole, Patel's desire to, quote, shut down the Hoover building is dramatic. It would immediately transform the country's top law enforcement agency. The consequences would be sweeping. There is no question about it. And that's actually the point. So if you're Donald Trump or one of his supporters, the idea of not transforming the FBI is what would bother you. Radical transformation is just what the doctor ordered in this case, and it would be malpractice not to treat the disease itself. Most people, though, don't really know exactly why Donald Trump is furious at the FBI, and that's for an understandable reason. The media got the story very, very wrong and has a self-interest in not telling the truth here. Plus, the details are absurdly complicated and impossible to follow. Just personally, I've covered this story for years, and it's easy to forget all the details of the corruption. So I just want to put a few facts on the table. High-level officials at the FBI talked privately about having a, quote, insurance policy against the election of a presidential candidate in 2016. An FBI attorney was convicted of lying on a warrant to spy on an American connected to the Trump campaign. That illegal spying was approved by a FISA court. The FBI reimbursed some of Christopher Steele's expenses in production of the discredited Steele dossier, which was being financed by Donald Trump's political opponents. Andrew McCabe, former deputy FBI director, said no surveillance warrant would have been sought without the insane Steele dossier, which was, again, funded by Donald Trump's political opponents. A special counsel report found, quote, FBI personnel acknowledged both then and in hindsight that they did not genuinely believe there was probable cause to believe that the Trump campaign was knowingly engaged in clandestine intelligence activities on behalf of a foreign power or knowingly helping another person in such activities. That special counsel report also found, quote, our investigation revealed that senior FBI personnel displayed a serious lack of analytical rigor towards the information that they received, especially from politically affiliated persons and entities. In particular, there was a significant reliance on investigative leads provided or funded directly or indirectly by Trump's political opponents. The department did not adequately examine or question these materials and the motivations of those providing them. So, there is obviously much more, of course. An FBI field office sought to develop sources at Catholic parishes that offer Latin Mass. FBI informants were at the January 6th riot and involved in the plot to kidnap Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer. The Bureau opened investigations into parents protesting at school board meetings. The FBI, if you're on the left, misused its power to surveil BLM protesters. In short, the FBI is an absolute mess, and that is putting it nicely. As in the days of J. Edgar Hoover, who wiretapped activists and leaked false stories to damage communists, the FBI is abusing its powers to meddle in domestic politics. This is the environment into which Kash Patel, described by David Ignatius accurately actually in 2021 as a Zelig figure of Trump's battle with the quote-unquote deep state, that's the environment into which Kash Patel enters. Republicans, once supportive of and deferential to the FBI in its war against communists and radicals and suspected Islamic terrorists in more recent years, have now found common cause with defenders of civil liberties on the left who've been suspicious of the FBI since the Cold War. As Eli Lake, who was on this show this week, said of Patel's stance on the FBI and the free press yesterday, a decade ago, anyone who said such a thing would be disqualified from running the FBI. So should Americans welcome Patel's radical plan to reform the Bureau? How did we get here, where a Republican president and his nominees sound like Frank Church? My take, personally, is that we got here by the FBI getting really, really out of control. And that should be an acceptable conclusion on both sides of the aisle, especially since people in the FBI have admitted to major errors in recent years. But nobody can explain all of this better than Matt Taibbi, who has covered the FBI for years and years and years. As controversy swirls around Kash Patel, Matt dug deep into the FBI's recent history over at Racket, producing an incredible pattern of corruption that must be explored right now as the future of the Bureau hangs in the balance. Matt Taibbi joins us now. Matt, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me, Emily.
We were talking a little bit before we started to tape just how hard it is to make these years of scandal at the FBI digestible to your average reader. Even I have followed this for a really long time, working at the Federalist for a really long time. We were covering constantly. And it's hard to keep all of the threads in a way that's legible. First of all, Matt, here's a question. How do you do it? Do you have your own type of dossier on the dossier? How do you keep track of all of these details when you need to in a story like your one on Kash Patel and the bell kind of tolling for the FBI, put them all in one place?
I guess in my case, it's more that I was very personally obsessed with the story in kind of an unhealthy way. I mean, it was the key episode that led to me leaving what you would formerly call the mainstream media. And I wasn't alone in that. There were a bunch of people who kind of were forced out. And from the beginning of the story, I was really fascinated by it because it was either the biggest espionage story in history, right? Putin putting a Manchurian candidate in the White House, or it was the biggest lie in history. And so I was fascinated from the beginning, paid a lot of attention to it. And probably without that unhealthy curiosity throughout, I would have lost track early because, as you say, there are 10 billion documents with this thing and many different avenues of inquiry, and it's hard to keep track of.
So we're at a point now where there's an incoming administration that actually wants to deeply, for personal reasons, reform the FBI. And I wanted to see, Matt, if you could explain to a leftist, I'm sure there are some people watching, what happened at the FBI if you're, a leftist, for example, who really doesn't like Trump, reasonably so, but blanches at what J. Edgar Hoover, for example, did to Martin Luther King Jr. and the Black Panthers. How would you explain the last 10 years of the FBI to somebody in that position?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I hope there are people like that in the audience. I mean, I was one of those people. For people who aren't old enough to remember this history, before the mid-'70s, before J. Edgar Hoover died. Remember, he was in office for 48 years. There's a widespread misconception this week that the 10-year term for heads of the FBI, that's not a thing where they wanted people to serve 10 years. That was a minimum they imposed to prevent somebody like J. Edgar Hoover from happening again. A maximum they imposed. Hoover made the FBI into a domestic intelligence service very much like the Stasi or the KGB, and that's not really an exaggeration. Their primary goal was a political domestic intelligence gathering operation from the very earliest years of its history. That's what it did. It gathered information about prominent people, and the director used that information to leverage politics in a direction that he wanted. Now, when things started to have significant cultural change in the 50s and 60s, Hoover openly talked about using the FBI as a way to discredit, discourage, and disrupt figures like Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, Stokely Carmichael, even Muhammad Ali. They had programs like COINTELPRO, which are not conspiracy theory lore. They're real. You can look up these documents yourself. You can read many books about them. And the FBI was in a place where it was not taking people to court about things, but was instead engaging in these off-the-books actions to sort of dispense justice in its own way without, having to deal with judges. And what happened after 9/11 is that they sort of regained the ability to do that again. And they started doing these disruptions or incapacitations, and that was in its an early state in the Bush years when were doing it to Muslim intellectuals, for instance, and immigrants. In the Trump years, they started to do it to the actual president of the United States, and that's probably the hump that most liberals can't get over. They just don't believe it, but it's absolutely what happened.
Yeah, it's so interesting, just even going back to the history and tracing the evolution of the FBI, which is something that you've done. It actually is sort of following a pattern, right, Matt, that it starts and then you have the church committee and, there's reforms, like FISA itself is a reform that comes out of the church committee, but the FBI really never gives up on never really wants to give up this power. Is that a good way to look at how it comes to approach the Trump campaign?
I think for a while, the Bureau was actually managed and run by people who, even though they had political ambitions, they did seem a little bit more interested in building the FBI into, a professional police force. They at least marketed themselves that way, right? And with the help of Hollywood, they regained the reputation of being the great experts who could, descend on a situation, and they're very good at solving certain kinds of crimes like bank robberies. They had a window to sort of regain powers that they lost after the Church Committee, and they started abusing those powers almost right away. For instance, things like national security letters, which gave them carte blanche to collect information about basically anybody from private companies. And most people don't know about this stuff because they weren't paying attention. When Trump came along, though, by the time Trump came along, the Bureau was already, had so transformed itself away from its policing mission and toward its political and intelligence gathering mission back to its roots, that it just treated this incoming president as a hostile entity that it needed to control. And it had done that to a degree with some presidents in the past, but never as successfully as they did with Trump.
So what's interesting about that is, and I think this is obvious to people like you who have been covering this for a long time, it is the Republican disinterest or the Republican unabiding support for the FBI over the course of the War on Terror and the Bush years that probably laid the groundwork, I think this might be safe to say, Matt, for what ended up happening to Donald Trump. It kind of the FBI metastasized in the shadow of Republican concern.
Oh, absolutely. I know that from interviewing some of the Republican members who had some things to say, kind of, let's just say, more on background about programs like the FISA Enhancements Act. Most of the big reforms that gave the FBI enhanced power, like the Patriot Act, were done so with kind of overwhelming Republican support. And yeah, there was a kind of difficult karmic moment for a lot of Republicans, I think, after Trump got elected, when they realized that a lot of the things that they were looking at were the consequence of letting, their own sort of sponsored entity get out of control. That's definitely a subtext to all this.
And again, if I'm a leftist and I'm thinking to myself, why would the FBI hate the Republican presidential candidate? Why would, in 2016, the FBI be, in a way, favorable to Hillary Clinton over Donald Trump? Donald Trump is kind of a quote-unquote law and order type of guy in the, I guess maybe Nixonian sense historically, but help us understand why it is that Peter Strzok, Lisa Page, these sort of familiar names, Andy McCabe, why would they want to spy on Donald Trump? Did they really think he was a Russian asset? What's going on in their minds as they open Crossfire Hurricane and proceed to use Christopher Steele and all of that?
Well, Trump did have some supporters. There was a group of people in the New York office who were kind of more on his side, and these were the same people who were building the email case against Hillary Clinton. But the bulk of the FBI leadership, it's kind of similar to Wall Street, where almost everybody you meet on Wall Street is socially liberal, even if they're politically conservative, or even if they've in the past voted Republican. In the FBI, especially in the leadership, and we find this out through reports like the Inspector General's report about the FISA business with the FBI and Russiagate. In their text messages, they just openly loathe Donald Trump. But I think on a larger level, Trump was hated by the entire intelligence community because he campaigned against them. He did not rise through the kind of accepted ranks of how politicians reach office. And he did things like say, I'm not going to take my presidential daily briefing every day. I don't need you guys in my ear for an hour. We'll do it once a week, maybe, or call me if you've got something important, which was unprecedented. No president had ever kind of told the intelligence community that, I'll call you when I need you. And so I think he was seen as somebody who was repugnant socially within the FBI, but also as somebody who didn't have the reverence and respect for not just the FBI, but the CIA and the NSA and all these people. A lot of figures we'll talk about this idea, and I think I remember hearing Jeremy Scahill talk about this once, that, when presidents come to Washington, they're sort of sat down after they get elected and told what's what by the heads of the big agencies. And Trump was going to be the first person who was not going to sit there for that briefing and just say, yes, sir, no, sir. I mean, he had already announced on the campaign trail that he was going to be his own person, and I think that was a big problem.
Yeah, that makes sense. And, in the figure of Kash Patel, who is suddenly, obviously for good reason, focus of new scrutiny. I think a lot of people actually weren't even familiar with Kash Patel, but there was a description of him in the Washington Post that I really liked, of him as a Z-League figure in the Trump-Russia affair. And I wanted to see if you agreed with that, Matt.
I love that movie, so yeah, that's perfect.
It is perfect. Yeah. And so why is it perfect when it comes to Kash Patel? Why is he that player in this bigger story?
For one thing, out of the entire universe of Justice Department figures or intelligence figures that could have left their jobs and said, I'm not going to go along with Russiagate, which really involved not just the FBI, but many different bureaucracies. He was really the only one who raised his hand and said, yeah, I'm willing to put my name out there as somebody who is going to look at this from a different direction. And he went to go, to work with Devin Nunes, who at the time was the head of the House Intelligence Committee. That Republicans still controlled the House Intel Committee when Trump was in the early part of Trump's presidency, which was fortunate because that meant they had subpoena power to look at the origins of Russiagate. And so while the rest of the country was completely focused on the Mueller investigation and hanging on every, imagined and real development with that investigation, Patel had his own team. Actually, there were two teams investigating how Russiagate got started, how the whole investigation happened. And nobody was interested in that. You have to remember, most of the people who actually run the FBI don't have a lot of field experience. They haven't put cases together. They haven't done real investigations. They've overseen them in the past, but they haven't done them. Kash actually has. He's worked as a prosecutor. I think he's got a criminal justice degree. He's been a public defender. And the report that he put together about Russiagate, with the help of Devin Nunes, turned out to be like 100% on the money. I mean, I had my doubts about the guy when I first came across him, but that report, turned out to be completely right, and everybody was against him.
So the report you're mentioning is the Nunes memo, and you've written about this, and you've again covered this many times. If you could just remind us of basically how the Nunes memo came about. It was kind of competing with, at the time, a Schiff memo that he put out to, if I'm remembering correctly, preemptively rebut the Nunes memo, but the Nunes memo, which is dismissed by the media offhand as a joke, has been mostly validated, as my understanding, Matt, since we've had the Durham report, the Horowitz report, the Horowitz IG report, the Durham special counsel report. It sort of seems like he did get it right.
Oh yeah, he got it absolutely right. I wouldn't even say mostly validated. I would say, unless there's something small that I can't remember, the main points of the Nunes memo were that the warrant to conduct secret FISA surveillance on the former Trump aide Carter Page, which was incredibly important for a couple of reasons, and people forget this. The FBI sought surveillance on this guy Carter Page in September of 2016, before the election had taken place. At that time, the FBI's Crossfire Hurricane probe into Trump and Russia had basically already stalled. The original focus of their investigation was a guy named George Papadopoulos, and that story turned out to be a nothing, and they basically dropped it, except as a lying to investigators case. It didn't have any juice as an actual conspiracy case. So they were looking for somebody else to investigate so they could keep the probe into Trump and his possible connections to Russia going. And they picked this guy, Carter Page, who, there's a long backstory here that's not important to get into. The important thing is the FBI essentially lied to the FISA court in its warrant application. It used the Steele dossier as evidence to support the idea that Page was some kind of cutout for the Russians. And that was, of course, paid opposition research. And then they did some other incredibly unethical things, like citing as supporting evidence a Yahoo article that itself was quoting Steele. So they were citing the same evidence twice, like, a major no-no to do in a court application. But the main thing is they lied in the FISA application and they used the Steele dossier in the FISA application. And that's important because without that, the FBI probably doesn't get the FISA warrant and the investigation probably dies at that point. There was no more there for them to pursue. And also, that surveillance authority didn't just cover Carter Page. It covered everybody who talked to Carter Page and everybody who talked to those people who talked to Carter Page. It's what they call a two-hop warrant. So they got a window into the entire Trump universe through this one moment, and they did it by lying.
Something that's kind of interesting about Kash Patel is if you watch that whole Sean Ryan interview he did in September, he actually defends FISA powers. He says, we have all of these immigrants, potentially terrorists coming into the country. I'm one of those people who doesn't think we should just get rid of FISA, something like that. I'm paraphrasing him, obviously, but from the perspective of people who are concerned about civil liberties and all of that, it's kind of interesting to hear that from Kash Patel, but not entirely surprising given that he's a conservative. He's an ideological conservative. He's a Trump ideologue. What would you expect to potentially see in terms of FISA reform if Kash Patel is confirmed? Something of a big if at this point, but if he's confirmed and he's able to work with Congress, what does that even look like? If you keep FISA, but maybe you get rid of two hops or something like that, what would you expect, Matt?
Probably something more in the realm of oversight of the court and its decisions. The problem now is that the court is so secretive that there's no way to check whether or not the representations to the court are accurate. Something like that will probably happen. And then there's something else that probably civil libertarians won't like, but may not be the worst idea, actually, which is to decentralize the FISA process. As it stands, these FISA warrants they're all bottlenecked. They go through Washington, and the submissions to the court are all kind of done through one group of people who amass enormous power within the Bureau. Now, the reason that's kind of a problem is that some people who work out in branch offices, they might want to do a FISA on somebody who's just arrived in a city like, I don't know, Chicago or Seattle or whatever it is, but they have to go through Washington to get that done. Now, but the FISA judges are all over the country, so it could be decentralized, and I think that probably will happen because they're going to try to decentralize the Bureau generally, and I think it'll end up being a net plus because you'll have fewer of these politicized kind of investigations.
And Kevin Clinesmith, obviously he did not go to jail, but he was convicted of lying on that FISA warrant. They omitted all kinds of things, and Kevin Clinesmith himself said that Carter Page was not a source for the government. We knew he was a source for the government. So that was, it's some of this is not like even speculation. This is plain as day. This happened.
Yeah, that's why it's so infuriating, Emily, to read stuff like, the CNN talking about alleged abuses at the FBI. One of the FBI lawyers was criminally convicted for putting, a recommendation about Carter Page in an email, adding the words "not a source," so that the issue of him being an active CIA source in good standing, who had notified the agency the instant he was approached by Russians in the past, who was in constant contact with the government, that person is not going to be subject to FISA surveillance. Those three little words, "not a source," allowed the FISA court to think that the previous approach by Russians was evidence against him when it was actually evidence for him. And so that's an incredibly serious crime. Like, imagine if you did that in a normal criminal case. It's a huge thing.
And I remember it was pretty clear that the FBI, definitely Adam Schiff, were dripping out tidbits. They were leaking to the media. Christopher Steele himself, which we know he was working for the FBI, talked to David Korn. you can look back on some of this and sort of put the pieces together and assume what was going on. But can you talk to us a little bit about how the FBI manipulated media? There's a Hoover story that I like. I don't like it. It's a horrible story, but about Jean Seberg, who was an actress, and Hoover planted in gossip rags that she had that this would even be a story is insane, but a biracial baby with a Black Panther communist. It is the way the story ends is horrible. She loses the baby. She ends up committing suicide. It's just an insane story. But the media printed it. They took it from Hoover, printed it. And I think we saw something like that repeat for years over the course of the Russia collusion hoax. And Matt, you've followed exactly how the media lapped a lot of this up. But it seems to me like a lot of it was because it was directly being planted and they weren't being skeptical.
Yeah, so at one point, I actually tried to do a story about all of the illegal leaks that drove the RussiaGate case. I compiled a list with the help of some people who are investigating the origins of the investigation. And I think at the end, I ended up with something like 15 or 16 incidents of things that probably would have been criminally illegal to leak. There are things that people in government aren't allowed to tell reporters about, like classified signals intelligence. In some cases, even the reporters can get in trouble for this stuff. But there was a ton of this activity in the Russiagate episode. Some of it wasn't illegal to do, but it was improper for, say, a source for the FBI to do, like talking to Michael Isikoff and tipping him off that maybe maybe Carter Page is an agent of the Kremlin, or talking to David Korn at Mother Jones. You remember there was another very big story about Michael Flynn talking to the Russians, right? That would seem to have been based on signals intelligence, and I have a lot of questions about that story. And there's a whole long list of these stories, and also the whole idea about things like the P tape. That only came about through a very complicated maneuver in which the four heads of intelligence agencies from the NSA, FBI, CIA, and the Director of National Intelligence, they met with Trump. They briefed him on this idea that there was material that the Russians might use to blackmail him. This was the Steele dossier and the P-tape stuff that they already knew was not real. They did that briefing, and then they leaked word of the briefing immediately to a number of reporters, including CNN. And it's because of that leak that all of this kind of spiraled out of control, and the whole Steele dossier was published by BuzzFeed, if you remember. That was a big controversy. So yeah, leaking was a huge part of this whole thing. And as you point out, this is very much in the FBI's tradition. They did this throughout the 50s about suspected communists. They did it throughout the 60s about black nationalists or opponents to the Vietnam War. And that's all part of that thing I was talking about before about disruption and discrediting. That's, you can find that in FBI documents where they're advising their people on how to proceed. Those words are important: disrupt, discredit, and fake stories are part of that picture.
Setting up a briefing on a document that is lacking in credibility and then leaking it is just so, Hoover would be so proud of Boy Scout Jim Comey for that.
Yeah, it's ingenious, really, because if you look back at the whole history, if you're a geek enough like me to be obsessed with how all this came to light, it later came out that the people who had hired Steele had shopped the Steele dossier to at least 9 different news agencies during that time, but nobody would publish it for the very good reason that they couldn't confirm any of it. So the logistical problem was, how do we get this before the eyes of the American public when even the media won't, even this media, this crappy media that we have, won't get over its ethical boundaries to publish this thing. So what they came up with was, let's get them to report on this briefing. Now the contents of the Steele dossier are newsworthy, even if they're not true. So now we can publish all of it and we can talk about all of it. It was ingenious. And there's even a memo where Comey himself talks about the situation, saying that the thing that was holding people back, and was that the news organizations didn't have a hook to publish, and that briefing gave them the hook.
Now, you mentioned reporters getting in trouble for publishing some of those leaks, or they could get in trouble. There are cases where that would be a possibility. Kash Patel has said that he would, if he were confirmed as FBI director, go after reporters potentially. Is not something that I think I basically ever support. Like maybe in 0.00001% of cases, there's something to be said for it. But in this case, Matt, are there vulnerabilities among, I'm thinking of, like, let's say Natasha Bertrand or other people, Michael Isikoff potentially. What could Kash Patel actually do to reporters if he's confirmed?
So this isn't an area of law that I really know a ton about, because I've never done this kind of reporting before. I mean, as you know, Emily, the basic rule is your sources are the ones who are taking the risk, right? Like they can steal things, but they'll be the ones who will get in trouble. In the Obama years, it started to happen that reporters began to be threatened along with sources for violations of things like the Espionage Act. I think Obama brought 8 Espionage Act cases, and he sort of broke the seal on going after reporters by threatening, I think it was James Risen as a possible co-conspirator. And there was never actually a case, but the idea that he was a co-conspirator came up. Here, from what I understand, it would be some kind of very narrow situation with the leaking of a certain kind of signals intelligence. But there might also be other situations that we've never even encountered before, where there might be some kind of argument for conspiracy, where people just aren't acting as journalists, they're doing something else entirely. And maybe a prosecutor would describe what they were doing more as, in furtherance of a political, kind of electoral fraud, for instance, than as a traditional leaking crime. I'm not sure, this has been run by me sort of in the past in kind of a breezy way, so I haven't looked into it. Kash has also said that he hasn't worked out whether these would be criminal or civil offenses yet. So that's something to keep in mind. But he did say whatever it would be something that would be done through the courts, which is at least reassuring. Like you, I'm normally not in favor of this kind of thing, but I sort of want to see what the accusations are first.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that's a good point. Now, Matt, if, let's say, Kash Patel is hypothetically like a neo-Frank Church, he gets in there, he has a lot of good ideas for reform. If, from your knowledge of the bureaucracy at the FBI, which is vast, would anybody who wants to seriously, dramatically reform the FBI be able to, or is there a quote-unquote insurance policy, to quote Peter Strzok, that is likely to prevent any serious changes from actually taking place?
I don't know. I guess we'll find out. I'm sure if there are skeletons in the closets of any of the people who are thinking of making any of these moves, they will be brought to bear in this situation. But I have talked to a few former FBI agents in the last week or so, and some of the ideas that would come up have widespread support within the Bureau among people in the field. One way to do it, I think, would be to appeal politically to the people who are not working out of the Washington office. If Kash Patel made the rounds and presented himself to each one of the big bureaus and said, look, I just want to make cases. I want to have the FBI do what it does. Go after child pornographers, go after bank robbers, health fraudsters, whatever it is. I'm going to free you up to do those things, but I need your support in this thing that I'm trying to do. And the obstacle that most people agree exists is the Washington office, which has become hyper politicized and packed with people who have never done any casework, who are basically political creatures. And I think they're incredibly dangerous. I think the record shows that. And they've gotten very much out of control in the last 10 or 20 years. And there would be a lot of support for going after those folks. But we just don't know how many people in Congress are gonna go for it, because, as you say, if there are levers to be pulled, they're going to pull them, I think.
Yeah, and so my final question on that is, should the left be concerned? And when I say the left, I actually mean, I should say the left and civil liberties supporters who look at the FBI. One thing I disagree with some of my friends on the right is that, like, is the FBI a swamp of, like, progressive wokeness, as a lot of conservatives say? I mean, we've seen some questionably abusive surveillance of left-wing activists still in the last...
The African Socialist Group, right?
That's right. So there's still some of that happening. Do you think that people like Kash Patel or Trump supporters that have kind of come around, Johnny-come-latelys, to this idea of the FBI being abusive in its surveillance of activists will further abuse their powers? Can they be trusted to sort of protect civil liberties, or do you worry that somebody like Kash Patel actually will even take it up a notch when it comes to surveilling the quote-unquote woke left if things like BLM protests continue, anything along those lines?
Yeah, we have to hope not, right? I mean, I think that's going to be a temptation. It's similar to the censorship question. There's a big machine there that is going to be a temptation for any political actor to come in and say, yeah, maybe I could use this, for my own purposes instead of dismantling it. And that's the big risk. That's why it's so important to, kind of take apart the machine first and then think about what the best use of it might be in a better world. We definitely don't want to have the FBI putting informants in every leftist activist group in the country, or every pro-Palestinian activist group in the country. And this is why it's been so frustrating listening to people who are Democrats or you would describe themselves as liberals laud the FBI in the last 8 years or so. These folks aren't your friends. They may not like Donald Trump, but they're certainly not progressives in any real sense. Especially the people in the Washington office. I think what they're interested in is gathering intelligence about everybody, and that includes groups on the left. One thing I will say, the last thing I'll say is Kash. And I hope this is true about him, but most of the people that I've ever encountered, either in policing or in the intelligence world, or in law enforcement agencies like the FBI, the thing they really want to do is just make good cases. They just want to be left alone to do what they do. The thing they hate doing is political make work that is of questionable, dubious legality, like following some little old lady who, may have been on the mall the day of January 6th, instead of going after a child pornographer. That kind of stuff drives real law enforcement people crazy. And if Kash ends up doing that in the other direction, he's going to lose the Bureau just as quickly as Chris Wray has. So I hope he understands that. My expectation is that he won't go in that direction, but yeah, you're right to bring it up as a possibility, I think.
Super interesting perspective. Matt Taibbi, thank you so much for joining the show.
Thank you, Emily. Appreciate it. Thanks for having me on.
Matt Taibbi really is probably my favorite working journalist, so anytime he stops by the show, it's an honor and a privilege. He knows so much, he's followed this so closely, and he's just intellectually such an honest person. So kind of getting a chance to dig deep into his reporting over the last decade or so is helpful, as so many people here in Washington are outraged by the prospect of Kash Patel taking over the FBI. And, the question then for them becomes, what are your alternatives? Who are your alternatives? What are your alternative plans for the FBI? Because it simply cannot continue on the course that it's on right now. And I think a lot of people ultimately would say they don't really want to disrupt it very much from the course that it's on right now. So that's sort of where we are. And as you look at, even just the fact pattern Matt lays out, as I tried to do in the introduction to this video, these are deep, deep endemic problems. They are serious. They are affecting American politics. One of the most frustrating things, if you study Cold War history closely, is that we really don't know the extent of where American politics would have gone if there weren't informants embedded in all of these left-wing groups at the time. There was actually, I believe it was the CIA, spied on the Goldwater campaign. It wasn't just the left, although it was mostly the left. But we never really would have, we still never can really know exactly how politics would have progressed, especially in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, if there weren't so much FBI meddling in those groups, whether it was the Black Panthers, whether it was Hollywood. It's hard for us to know how these different groups, how popular they would have been, how strong they would have been, how radical they would have been if there weren't informants embedded in them, if there weren't surveillance, if there wasn't surveillance that was changing the trajectory of these groups, was changing their activities. It's just hard to know, and it's hard to have democratic control over your country when this meddling is happening from law enforcement at a level that is not just keeping Americans safe, but is primarily helping the surveillance powers of these agencies that lose sight of what they're actually doing. So it's really important to have this conversation, because right now, the fate of the FBI is hanging in the balance, and there could be a course correction for the better. So thank you for tuning in. Like I said at the beginning of the episode, just on the podcast, I've learned recently how many of you are listening. That means the world to us. Thank you for subscribing wherever you download your podcasts. Thank you for helping the channel grow so much so quickly here on YouTube. The best thing you can do to help is subscribe to the Undercurrents channel. You can also subscribe to the full premium edition of the show over at undercurrents.tv. Thank you so much for tuning in today.